Welcome this morning to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Meadville, a beacon for free thinkers since 1825. With us this morning as our guest speaker is our familiar friend, Bruce Harland. Bruce is the Executive Director of Women's Services here in Meadville and has been working with abuse victims, he says, for 38 years. He and his wife, Lynn, just celebrated 30 years of marriage and have 3 children. 2 of them are in college, but home. The oldest graduated from college in 2018, but he is home as well now. Bruce asks us to offer up a little prayer for his family. Our opening words this morning are from the Reverend Howard Thurman. In the stillness of the quiet, if we listen, we can hear the whisper of the heart giving strength to weakness, courage to fear, hope to despair. During the service, I invite you to enter personal joys and sorrows in the chat room, and then at a certain point later in the service, we'll be sharing those with everyone. Despite our decision that it isn't safe to bring people together in our beautiful sanctuary during COVID, we continue to offer our financial gifts to sustain this church and its work in the community. If you haven't yet turned in your 2021 pledge, we ask you to do so soon so the budget can be finalized. And to donate electronically, please visit the church website at uumeadville.org. You can also mail your checks directly to the church. This month's Share the Plate recipient is the Center for Family Services. Please join me, if you'd like, in reciting the words of our chalice lighting, which is from the Passover Haggadah. May the light we now kindle inspire us to use our powers to heal and not to harm, to help and not to hinder, to bless and not to curse, to serve you, Spirit of life. Community that nurtures spiritual growth, an atmosphere of mutual trust. Our mission is to be a faith community devoted to love and respect, reason, and justice. Our reading this morning is from the song by Leonard Cohen entitled Come Healing that you heard during the prelude. I'm going to read you just the first 3 stanzas of it. Oh, gather up in let me start again. Oh, gather up the brokenness, bring it to me now, the fragrance of those promises you never dared to vow. The splinters that you carry, the cross you left behind. Come, healing of the body. Come, healing of the mind. And let the heavens hear it, the penitential hymn. Come, healing of the spirit. Come, healing of the limb. As you listen to the homily, please reflect on the following questions that we hope will serve as conversation starters during the breakout sessions that immediately follow the homily. These questions are, what are some barriers to healing? And if you had to make a plan to overcome one of the identified barriers, what would that plan look like?
Okay, I think this is where I begin.
That's right.
Welcome, everyone. When I told my wife, Lynn, I was being asked to speak at the UU church, she looked at me and said, again? To which I replied, well, how many good speakers do you think there are in town? And of course, she said, probably one less than you think, which I think proves the old adage that behind every successful man is a surprised woman. So I'm going to do something that's pretty self-indulgent this morning. My talk, Let the Healing Begin, is really intended for me. You see, I have some healing to do myself, and it's long overdue. So here's my story. You know, since March, all of my children are home with us because of the pandemic. 2 are in college, but are studying remotely, and so they are home. The oldest came back from Columbus after graduating from college 2 years ago. And he and I were having a discussion, I think back in September. I don't even remember what the discussion was about, but something triggered what I thought were dormant and resolved feelings around all of the stories of abuse and violence that I've been told over the course of my career. You see, since 1982, I estimate that I have probably worked with about 1,000 kids and over 1,500 adults, all of whom have personally told me their stories. Now, I don't remember, and I don't profess to remember all of their names, but I do remember their faces and, of course, all of their stories. I won't go into any detail about the kinds of abuses I've heard from them, but if you will, imagine the worst kinds of things that one human being can do to another, then multiply it by a factor of 10, and you will start to get a picture of what I am talking about. And remember, all of these heinous acts are perpetrated by someone who claims to love the victim. So as I'm talking with my son, some of these stories start to pour out of me. First one and then another. And after about 15 minutes, I'm looking at my son, who appears ashen and dumbstruck. He apologizes and quickly leaves the room. Lynn says to me, where did all that come from? Well, I have no idea, really. I mean, I'm a pretty stable guy, and I pride myself on working in this field for 38 years and not having burned out. I'm not an alcoholic. I don't take drugs. I don't have a gambling problem or other addictions. I think, in fact, I manage all of the stress and the pain and suffering that I see pretty well. I certainly never take my work home with me, so my family never really knows the kind of day that I've had. I apologized to my son the next day, and I sought to explain what had happened, but I chalked it all up to an anomaly. Then, shortly thereafter, I had a similar meltdown with my board of directors at a women's services board meeting. You see, our neighbor on Spring Street has been flying the Confederate flag for over 2 years now. But since this summer, they have taken to being more vocal. They've been hurling racial slurs and other derogatory comments our way. I wrote an editorial about the Black Lives Matter movement and symbols of hate like the Confederate flag and about systemic racism. But my board was divided on whether or not we should release it. And during this discussion, I started thinking about all the people I knew who had suffered from systemic oppression. And I started sharing their stories with board members. And again, one story after another poured out of me. There was even a hint of anger in my voice. Why is it, I said, that it's always us that has to speak publicly about these matters? Where are my colleagues? Where are the other agencies? Where are the other folks in this community? Why aren't they speaking out? I remember a few years ago when Carmen was your pastor and another local pastor who was moved to speak on an issue around sexual violence. Something had bubbled up nationally and they were feeling compelled to say something about it. And so this person called me to ask for some background information. And thinking I had missed her editorial, I asked how it went sometime later. And the person replied, well, in the end, they decided against publicly addressing the issue, deciding instead to let the UU Church address it. So I certainly know what that feeling is like. So I pulled myself together and I apologized to my board, but obviously this was no longer an anomaly. Something had to be done. I had to begin to think about healing because obviously I was carrying around some pain and some unresolved feelings. Now I've been around the block long enough to know that if I'm experiencing something, then others probably have as well. Most, if not all of us, have experienced loss. Most, if not all of us, have experienced regret, made mistakes, said things we should not have said, or didn't speak when we needed to. Most, if not all of us, have suffered from unfulfilled dreams and aspirations, unrealized goals and objectives, and made promises that we didn't keep. Most, if not all of us, have been moved by the pain and tragic circumstances of others. Think 9/11, Sandy Hook, George Floyd. When we hear these horrific stories, we are at risk ourselves for vicarious traumatization or secondary traumatization. And after hearing a lifetime of tragic stories, coupled with our own personal experiences, it accumulates to the point where it begins to interfere. It was clearly interfering in my life. So we need to let the healing begin. But how? A couple of years ago, I broke my kneecap. I have since healed from that mishap, but lately I've wondered if that experience isn't instructive in terms of how we go about healing. So here's what happened. I took a spill at work and knew immediately something was wrong. I was in pain. I nearly went into shock. I couldn't stand. My knee had ballooned into something grotesque, and the people around me were aghast. Okay, lesson number 1, recognize and acknowledge that something has happened to you. You have just experienced something out of the ordinary, and you are not likely to recover from it quickly. Accept the reality of that and let the healing begin. I was taken to the hospital by ambulance. I was seen by a bevy of nurses and doctors. I was referred to a specialist. The problem was diagnosed and the proper course of action was prescribed. My kneecap was going to have to be surgically repaired by a team of specialists. Lesson number 2, seek help. Allow others to assist you during your time of need. Rely on the support and advice of others who possess specialized knowledge and have gained insightful experience. In this way, the healing can begin. Now, after surgery, I was told to stay off my leg for a while. I was given medication for the pain and to prevent infection. My family had to tend to me, wait on me, and my colleagues at work had to learn to deal without me and had to pick up the slack. Lesson number 3, learn to let go. None of us are supermen or superwomen. We can't do it all alone. We need one another. The people in our lives are not a burden to be managed, but rather a blessing to enjoy. When we acknowledge our own weakness and inadequacy, healing can begin. After several weeks, I began rehab. Now, rehab was just as painful as breaking my knee. In fact, the folks at the rehab pride themselves on making grown men cry. Well, true to the form, I cried. Rehab was a long and difficult road to travel. Even though my knee was technically repaired, I couldn't walk without a limp and my range of motion was limited. I needed rehab. So lesson number 4, recovery takes time. It's hard work and there are no shortcuts. Healing is a process and patience and hard work is required if there is to be a successful outcome. Well, it's been almost 3 years since I broke my kneecap. The memories are still fresh and vivid. I can still live that moment of falling and realizing I had done something awful to my knee. I don't want to repeat what happened to me. I could beat myself up for being so clumsy, or I could learn from what happened. You see, the pair of shoes that I was wearing, while comfortable, did not provide me with any traction when surfaces were wet. So now I wear different shoes when it rains or snows. Lesson number 5, learn the lessons and correct your behavior. They say that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. So make a course correction and let yourself off the hook when you made an oversight, or through your negligence, or even your willful disregard for safety. In other words, forgive. A parent was breaking up a fight between two siblings, and the parent told the two kids to apologize to one another, and they did as they were told. Afterwards, one of the kids said to their parent, "Well, I may have apologized on the outside, but on the inside, I am still very angry." Well, there is no point in burying the hatchet if the handle is still exposed. True forgiveness is the intentional and voluntary process by which we undergo a change in feelings and attitude regarding an offense, a shortcoming, a mistake, an omission, and overcome the negative emotions associated with that event, such as feelings of resentment, vengeance, disappointment, and regret. For me, I had to forgive my clumsiness. I had to frame my accident differently and in a positive way in order to completely heal from the experience. So, pun intended, to recap the lessons learned from my kneecap. 1, acknowledge that something out of the ordinary has happened to you. 2, seek help from those with applicable knowledge and experience. 3, rely on the support of family and friends. 4, recovery is possible, but it takes time and hard work. And 5, learn from the mistake, learn from what has happened, and make changes. In other words, evolve. I have concluded for myself that it may be time for me to talk with a professional about all of the vicarious trauma that I have accumulated over the years. One of the barriers that I had to get over was that being strong for others meant that I had to acknowledge my own inadequacies and susceptibilities. In other words, after 38 years, I have to make some changes so that I can let the healing begin. Thank you, and peace and blessings to each and every one of you. And now I think you're going to be put into a chat room. Yep. Breakout room. You'll have about 8 to 10 minutes to address the 2 questions.
We've just had a couple of joys and sorrows entered. Rick wants us to say some prayers for Josh and Jennifer, who tested positive this week. And also a candle of celebration and concern for Josh, who worked the polls and contracted the virus there, probably. I just like to offer up an expression of concern for my husband, Rich, who's been struggling with shoulder and neck problems for quite some time, and they've been sort of overwhelming lately, and he's partly because he loses sleep over them. So keep him in your hearts. Is there anybody else who would like to offer up a last minute joy or concern? Let us just take a minute of silent reflection on the joys and sorrows that were shared, and for all of those that remain unspoken in our hearts. Please join me in saying our chalice extinguishing words. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we meet again.